to the information that is going to be presented. We have a fantastic panel to wrap up what has been a very fulfilling day. So the next session, are we practicing at the top of our license? I asked Gary, what exactly does that mean? Sort of an amorphous title. So are we doing all that we can to do our best? This is really the session that is a challenge to providers. How are providers and clinical researchers bridging the gap and closing the divide between their sector and the patient community? So in this session, the panelists are tasked to provide solutions on how they are operating at the very top of their license to meet the heart of the healthcare ecosystem. And the heart of the healthcare ecosystem is truly patient care. So the examples that you are going to hear are in 3 different therapeutic areas. We're going to lead with MS, go to cardiology, and then neurology. So what I'm going to do up front is to just briefly introduce our panel, and then I will turn it over to them. We want to make sure to leave time for questions and answers. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Holly Schmidt, who is Vice President of Scientific Operations for the Accelerated Cure Project for MS. Holly has had a fantastic career at the top-level direction of ACP's MS repository, which provides highly characterized biospecimens from people with diseases and controls to scientists worldwide. She has guided the formation of the ACP Clinical Research Network and is working with CRN investigators and vendors to design and implement a study aimed at optimizing the Accelerated Cure Project. She has a degree in management as well as BS in material science and engineering, all from MIT. She is very active with the Alumni Association and has been serving on the Institutional Review Board of Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Dr. O'Feely is a professor of medicine, cardiology, and senior associate dean of clinical and translational research at Morehouse School of Medicine. In this role, Dr. O'Feely has a major effort with NIH Research Awards supporting discovery science and trainings across the translational research spectrum from bench to bedside and community, including the Atlanta Clinical and Translational Science Institute. She is founder of AccuHealth Technologies, empowering patient-centered health and wellness. Highly accomplished and a recipient of over 50 scientific services and health policy awards, she has been elected as a member of the National Academy of Medicine. Election to the Academy is considered one of the highest honors in the fields of health and medicine and recognizes individuals who have demonstrated outstanding professional achievement. And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Pamela Bratt has served in senior scientific leadership positions in industry, academia, and clinical practice. She has special expertise in evidence strategy planning, health economics, and clinical outcomes, pharmacoepidemiology, and evidence-based decision-making for products and devices. She was the first industry physician invited to speak at the World Health Organization on public health research strategies for high-risk obstetric and pediatric patients. Prior to joining industry, she provided intensive care to premature and high-risk infants and served as the medical director for a large high-risk follow-up program and was faculty at the Center of Evidence-Based Medicine at the University of Texas in Houston. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I should let you know that I'm not an MD. I don't have a license to practice anything. I have a driver's license. That's about it. So I don't really feel qualified to tell you all how to practice at the top of your license, but I am excited to tell you about a project that I'm involved in and hope that will be interesting to you. First slide. I've got the clicker. There we go. I wanted to tell you a bit about multiple sclerosis for those who may not be completely familiar with it. The project I'm going to tell you about is called the Multiple Sclerosis Research Engagement Partnership Network. So that's the disease that we're focused on. And MS is a neurological disease in which the immune system, for some reason, we don't yet know what that is, causes lesions in the brain and the spinal cord. It's the most common disabling neurological disease among young adults, with onset typically happening in somebody's 20s, 30s, or 40s. Because the central nervous system is involved, the effects are numerous and varied. A few of them include visual impairment, even to the point of blindness, motor impairment, weakness and paralysis, bowel and bladder dysfunction, cognitive impairment, mood disorders, and many others. Now, one bright spot about the disease is that there are 14 FDA-approved disease-modifying therapies, many of which have come forward over the last 5 to 10 years. And there are even more in the pipeline. But MS is a highly heterogeneous disease, and not every drug works in every person. And as of yet, we have no evidence to support personalized choice of therapy. So typically, people with MS go on one drug. If it doesn't work for them, they go on a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, and so on. And then finally, just a little epidemiological tidbit. MS is found worldwide, but it's more common in the upper and then the lower latitudes, and that might be related to a lack of sunshine exposure. So in addition to that basic information, I'd like to share 2 parallel misconceptions about MS. The first misconception, which was a long-standing one, is that it's a white matter disease. Brain and spinal cord tissue is made up of gray matter and white matter. White matter in the brain, as you can see in the MRI, is found in the central part of the brain, and it's so-called white matter because it's rich in a fatty substance called myelin, which appears white or whitish. And then gray matter, which is on the very outside, the cortex, and then the deep inner parts of the brain, also contains myelin, but just not to the same extent. Now, myelin is attacked and destroyed in MS in focal areas or lesions, and those are some of the bright spots that you might see on that MRI. Now, lesions are easier to detect in white matter because the absence of myelin is much more conspicuous in myelin-rich areas. And so for that reason, doctors and scientists considered it a white matter disease for decades. But recent research has determined that gray matter is also greatly affected MS. In fact, some people with MS have lesions that cover over half of their cerebral cortex, over half of the outer part of the brain, which does a lot of cognitive processing. So it's really astonishing that such a significant feature of the disease was overlooked by so many for so long. Similarly, just as MS used to be referred to as a white matter disease, MS also used to be considered a white person's disease. It used to be thought of as being relatively uncommon in minority populations. And for some people, this misconception led to a delayed diagnosis while their doctors looked everywhere else for explanations for their symptoms. But if you look at this montage, and I found that right away when I just Googled Google Images for people with MS, and you'll see that you do find people like Annette Funicello and Terry Garr, but there's also Montel Williams and Lena Horne and Richard Pryor. So MS obviously is not limited to Caucasians. And in fact, a couple of studies recently, one done within the military and one done within the Kaiser Permanente health system, found a higher frequency of MS in African Americans than in Caucasians. So we need to promote a more accurate image of MS as a disease that's found in all races and ethnicities. But what's even more important than minorities missing from the popular and historic image of MS is that they're also missing from MS research, not just in the past, but also in the present. Kind of a timely occurrence was last week. The FDA sent out their drug trial snapshot report on Ocrevus, which is the most recently approved drug for MS. And this was had a wealth of information, but the piece I was most interested in was the piece that reported the racial and ethnic composition of the phase 3 trials. And there were 3 of those for Ocrevus. And in these 3 trials, only 6 to 9% of the participants were not white. Out of nearly 2,400 total participants, only 86 were African American, and 113 were other minority races and ethnicities. And these are relatively recent studies with recruitment beginning in 2011, so past the point when we were aware that research should be inclusive. So here's a few specific reasons why this lack of representation is a problem. As I mentioned, there are 14 disease-modifying therapies for MS, some of which work better than others for a given person. How will the promise of personalized medicine, meaning the right drug for the right person at the right time, benefit everyone if everyone isn't represented in the evidence base? So how can we know if African Americans should go on Ocrevus or not if we only have data from 86 people? Another problem is that our understanding of MS in general will be incomplete if we don't have the benefit of full and inclusive participation. We know that MS plays out differently in different populations. For one thing, it tends to be more severe in African Americans. So there are probably very interesting and important differences in the causes and mechanisms of MS in African Americans, in Hispanics, in Native Americans, in Asian Americans, et cetera. And these differences could point the way to new strategies and treatments, but we'll never be able to make those breakthroughs without full inclusion in research. And then finally, a long overdue movement is underway on the topic of patient engagement. And patient engagement aims to give people affected with various health conditions a seat at the table in research discussions and decisions. Now, who is more likely to be included in or to step up for these roles? Common sense says that it's the people with prior research experience and research relationships who will be more likely to be invited or to volunteer to come forward. So promoting research participation is one step along the path toward giving people a voice whose voices have not always been heard. So a few years ago, my organization, Accelerated Cure Project for MS, became aware of a lack of diversity in our own research studies. And we realized that the problem went beyond just us, and we decided to do something about it. So we applied for, and we got, a PCORI Engagement Award. PCORI is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And the award is to promote greater racial and ethnic diversity in MS research. Our application called for doing a few key things. First of all, to form a network of different stakeholder organizations and individuals with a perspective on this issue, to combine knowledge and to combine assets and resources. Second is to work together to gather information to understand what is driving this racial and ethnic imbalance in MS research. And then based on this information, to develop and implement targeted outreach efforts. We want to continually analyze the effectiveness of what we're doing and adjust our methods accordingly. And then we also want to disseminate our findings and our materials so that other groups can benefit. So this slide speaks to the first step, building our network. We are fortunate to have very many worthy people and organizations accept our invitation to join forces. These include 2 people with MS who are helping to lead the project as patient advisors, 3 clinicians and researchers who care about the topic of diversity in MS research. We have several advocacy organizations for MS and for minority health and advancement, and you can see some of them listed there: MANA, the National Black Nurses Association, the National Hispanic Medical Association, and of course the National Minority Quality Forum. And so I think probably some of you out in the audience may belong to some of these groups. We also have 2 MS industry representatives who have research experience in this area. And then finally, we've got a strategy and communications firm, which is helping to pull everything and everyone together. So this is an amazingly strong network, and every single person on this slide is fully engaged in this effort. And it's not a closed network either. We look for other groups and other individuals to collaborate with. So our first step is to understand the barriers that have prevented equal representation in MS research in the past. And we don't have any MS-specific data to work with yet, but we've looked at literature from other health conditions to get us started, and we've also networked with other groups who have some information. The problem is at least 3-sided. There are barriers that apply to people with MS, to their healthcare providers, and to researchers. And here are a few examples of these barriers. For people with MS, barriers include mistrust of researchers, which we're all aware of, cost and logistics. They may have a lack of family support for their participation, and they also just may have a lack of information about research studies that might be available to them. Healthcare providers that treat minority patients with MS are important because a lot of people who do participate in medical research do so because they find out about it from their healthcare visits. But those providers who treat people with MS might worry that if they refer their patient to a research clinic for a study, they might lose that patient to that doctor or that clinic. Or they might worry that their patient will be harmed by participating in the study. And like patients, they might also just not be aware of studies that are available, that are relevant and could be of interest to their patients. And then finally, the researchers themselves and their study staff also face their own barriers. They might lack translational resources needed to recruit people who speak different languages. They might be hesitant to approach minority patients because they think they might be turned down. And then when it comes to those large clinical trials that are so important, the clinical research organizations that companies hire to choose and manage study sites might have their comfort zone of study sites, and these might not include sites that treat significant numbers of people in racial and ethnic minorities. So without incentives to go out a little further, they might stick with the sites that they're comfortable with already, and thus clinical trials don't include minority patients. We don't want to just focus on the negative. We also are interested in understanding the factors that might encourage minorities to participate in research. For patients, these could include the presence of health benefits, such as free medical care or greater attention to their medical needs. A study that uses language-appropriate materials might be more attractive to some people, and for others it might be awareness that the study will benefit others within their community, or factors that increase the convenience of participation, such as workable study visit hours or transportation support. Clinicians might be motivated by knowing that referring their patients to a study will provide specific benefits to those patients or to future patients through the availability of new treatments. And then researchers might be interested in knowing how the quality and the scope of their research could benefit through a more inclusive and intentional approach to recruitment. So which of these barriers and facilitators are the most important in MS? We don't know yet. So we're developing a survey just for people with MS. It's, I think, the first one that's been administrated. At least we've looked for others and haven't found one yet. So we're very excited about doing it. It will be distributed through the network partners and other collaborators, including clinics. We're reaching out to clinics that have a large number of MS minority patients. And the survey will let us see how perceptions and knowledge about research differ among racial and ethnic groups, among other things. We also want to dig deeper into the barriers and facilitators that are relevant to MS clinicians and MS researchers, since we feel these are also important to understand and address. And we'll determine how best to do that once the patient survey is underway. There's not as much research literature about those barriers, so there's not a proven roadmap to follow, so we'll have to think about how we're going to do that. So armed with that knowledge, we will then design and implement a number of outreach efforts aimed at the three target audiences. These include media-based outreach and live events for people with MS, things like conferences and publications for MS researchers, and educational materials aimed at MS clinicians. And I would love to come back next year and tell you how these are going. And I'm also hoping that some of you in the audience can help us as we move forward. So if you're able to spread the word about our upcoming survey for people with MS because you have access to lists or clinics or things like that, we'd love to have your help. If you know about other efforts similar to ours, perhaps in a different health-related area, we'd be interested in comparing notes. And we're also compiling a list of research studies that we think minority individuals with MS would be interested in. And these don't have to be MS-specific studies. For instance, I'm planning to include the All About Us study on our list. So please let me know if you know of any studies that you think would qualify. You can learn more about the effort at this URL, tinyurl.com/MSMinorityResearch. And you can also send an email to msminorityresearch@acceleratedcure.org to learn more. Or you can just come and find me after this panel. I will be around. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Holly. Dr. O'Feely, welcome.
Good afternoon. Oh, I cannot see that monitor. Oh, yeah, that's better. Yeah, much better. So these are my disclosures. I do have much of my research funded by NIH. I also serve on an advisory board with the companies listed. And as you heard, I have a patent. I will reference that very briefly, but the bulk of this conversation is really about heart failure. Let's see, am I pressing the wrong? Okay. So I can't read that, but I'll just tell you. So I just want to start very quickly, as we do in clinical care, by meeting a patient. So this is a patient I actually met in October of last year. We will call her Ms. Thomas. She's 36 years old. She's an African-American woman. And the reason I got to meet her was because her mom, who's a celebrity in the city, approached my institution and asked, I am very distressed. She sent this email. My only daughter is really sick. She has got very high blood pressure. I just lost my mom less than a month ago, and I don't want to lose my only daughter. And I understand that Dr. O'Feely is a person that we need to see because she has special interest in African-American women with heart disease. Of course, I don't want to give you the impression that I'm a celebrity doctor, because I'm not. But I was really quite struck by the despair in this woman's voice. And I said, of course I'm going to see your daughter. So I wound up seeing the young lady just a few days later. And what I learned was that it was actually a very unusual story, but I think it's instructive. She had really been well since until April, when she felt really like she had a cold, and then she wound up with a lot of GI symptoms but couldn't breathe. So she wound up going to urgent care, and they sent her directly to the hospital because they found her blood pressure was really elevated. Well, she was treated, blood pressure a little bit better, and they were about to send her home when her echo report came back, echocardiogram, which is ultrasound of the heart, and she has an ejection fraction of 18%. So everybody really got alarmed, and all the triggers went off, and so she was put on some medicines, and she was sent to visit consultation with the transplant team, and she was given an appointment to be put on a defibrillator. So that's the point at which I saw her. When I saw her, she was on 2 cardiac medications. As you can see, her blood pressure was still elevated. I can't read it, but I think it's about 170 over 105 or something. So this slide here is really to ask the question, and this is really where I begin to address something I think we all care about here, and that is the question that I asked. 10 years after the African American heart failure trial, have we advanced health equity? And the reason I ask this question is because in this particular study, which is a study of all the hospitals in the United States that are practicing very good medicine, practicing at the top of their license, doctor, and they evaluated how they were taking care of patients. It turns out less than 20% of patients were actually appropriately treated when it came to a drug that we call Bido. This compound was tested when I was president of the Association of Black Cardiologists, plug, from 2000 to 2002, and at that time, we did not have good drugs for heart failure for blacks because they were not responding to ACE inhibitors and beta blockers. So the trial was done. Everybody thought it was great data. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Very quickly, the trial was prematurely stopped. And what you can read whenever you get to read this is it says that this is effective in self-identified blacks who are symptomatic to treat them for heart failure. And the reason is what you see here. Dramatic result in terms of what was called placebo. A placebo here was really every drug that this woman is currently on. ACE inhibitors, beta blockers were, the placebo group. And on top of that, when this fixed-dose combination that is now Bido was used, there was a 43% survival advantage. So the question we have to ask is, why was this patient not treated? Because the patient was not at all on Bido. And you all know about the Institute of Medicine report back in 2002. There are all kinds of issues. But it turns out increasingly what's happening is either people say, well, we don't believe the data, or we don't really think you need that, or we don't think you can afford it. There are all these reasons that doctors speak to themselves and they don't share with the patient. So we got together, the Association of Black Cardiologists, the American Heart Association, and Morehouse School of Medicine, because we said there's something we've got to do about this, because there are doctors out there who who don't recognize that patients with heart failure could get better. Let me just tell you a little bit about this woman, what I did. I told her parents, she was in there, the mom, the stepmom is a doctor, the father's a judge, and everybody was in the room. And I said, I know you've been to Mecca, and you're here to see me, but I want to just assure you that I am going to do my best. I know this area, but you need to be on a drug that you're not on right now. They said, what is it? And I explained it to them, and the mother, the stepmom goes, I checked it out on the internet already. I said, okay. So we started it slowly, and the best news that I have to share with you today is this was a process. So from October to December, we were walking her through the therapy, and she came back to see me January 3rd, and her ejection fraction is 45%. She can breathe, she can walk her dog, she can do the things. She had said to me, I just want to be able to walk my dog, Dr. O'Feely. So, this is a very dramatic response that actually, we do see increases in ejection fraction, but this is special. And this is a woman who would have had a defibrillator. I guarantee you she would have had a defibrillator placed and then be on transplant, because none of those drugs affect the ejection fraction. So what the ABC is then doing is we're looking at this as an opportunity, because we've known about these improper therapies, because doctors get confused about what to use for African-American patients. Sometimes they think they don't have enough evidence. And obviously, in this case, even when they have enough evidence, they're not doing it right. So in terms of practicing, my model here is we're saying the ABC cardiovascular study, which is something that the Association of Black Cardiologists has made an investment in, and it is a different kind of a study, because we're basically saying, you know how you see all those ads on TV? Patients, African-American patients, are less than 100 or 200 in those heart failure trials, and yet someone wants you to treat those patients with those drugs. So what we said was, if you have a drug and you did not recruit enough African-American patients, we're working with the FDA to say, FDA, give us post-surveillance opportunity so we can actually monitor people. We're going to have about 10,000 heart failure patients in this database. We will know if people are being prescribed. We're not going to tell them what to prescribe, but once they prescribe, we have it. We're using very sophisticated technology with electronic medical records. And the study just was launched with the help of an FDA conference grant in Atlanta in March. And lots of ABC members, community partners, FQHCs, just regular people, and yes, maybe we accept a few academic health centers. Those are some of them, the research centers at minority institutions. We do have technology like a cell phone app that we're using to help people track what's going on, track their medications, and track their care. So I didn't want to go over. I do want to say the power here is, now, first of all, we know what's right. We know what the evidence base is, but somehow we don't always do what's right. So not only the doctors, the evidence-based guidelines are there, but doctors, we're now working with the National Minority Quality Forum to look at quality measures where doctors will actually be penalized if they don't do the right thing. And then on top of that, we will have a database that people can participate in clinical trials, because we know what people have. It's well curated. So again, I want to encourage you. Let me take a cue from my earlier colleague. We are at abccardio.org or msm.edu, and check us out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Feely. Dr. Brandt, please. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi. Okay. So what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about a very, very common neurological problem. But first, here we go. Whoops. First, my disclosure, I actually am a medical director for a pharmaceutical company called Astellas. There is a group of folks who worked on the research that I'm going to share with you today, along with a partnership and a collaboration that we have with NMQF. So you'll see that. What I do need to also disclose to you today, though, is that before working in pharmaceuticals, I was in practice for 10 years in an academic center. And what I'm sharing with you today is my personal opinion as a physician, a clinician,
and a clinical epidemiologist, and does not reflect any particular position from the company that I work with. So I want to talk just a little bit about some unknown risk in the Medicare population in patients who have overactive bladder. There we go. So first of all, urinary incontinence. This is a very common problem, one that is really under-recognized in the population in general. And what we know is that a large number of people are impacted by urinary incontinence. For reasons I think that we can all understand, this is not something that people talk about a lot, but it has a major impact not only on a person's quality of life, but also on their health outcomes as well. Overactive bladder is a condition that overlaps with urinary incontinence. Overactive bladder includes other symptoms aside from incontinence, such as frequency and urgency, meaning when somebody feels like they gotta go, they feel like they gotta run to the bathroom or they're gonna lose their continence, or people feel like they need to go all the time, or they're going a lot in the middle of the night. What we know about overactive bladder is that for women who are in their 40s, about a third of women start to have symptoms of overactive bladder. By the time that they're in their 70s, almost 1/2 of patients or of women have symptoms like this. In men, only about 17% or so of men in their 40s have this, but by the time that they're in their 70s, they're up to about half of men are experiencing these symptoms as well. So a little bit about the study collaboration with the NMQF. What we wanted to do was to really understand the prevalence of overactive bladder in the Medicare population, to describe the rate at which folks who have overactive bladder are treated, and also to do something else. We wanted to understand how often folks who are Medicare recipients are prescribed potentially inappropriate medications. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I'm going to skip this for now and really kind of just get right down to the numbers. So one of the things that we saw is that despite the fact that such a large percentage of folks experience incontinence and overactive bladder, it's a very small number in the Medicare population. So what we see is only about 7% of men and about 6% or so of women have a diagnosis of overactive bladder. And in the age categories of 60s and 70s, we're looking at 5%, maybe 9% in 75 years and older. What does that mean? Does that mean that folks in the Medicare population are protected from overactive bladder? No, it actually means that they're not being diagnosed. And so we know that this is a major problem, and yet folks are not being diagnosed with this particular problem. We also know that there is a pretty significant racial disparity in terms of diagnosis as well, with whites having the largest rate of diagnosis at 7.4% and blacks at 5.8%. Now, the American Urological Association has come out with treatment guidelines for quite some time, and it always starts with behavior modification or behavioral therapy. Now, one of the reasons why people say that they're not diagnosed with overactive bladder, or physicians say that they're not diagnosing it, is because, especially in the Medicare population, they're focusing on other issues that are clearly really important, that definitely have an impact on longevity. Things like cancer, like heart disease, like diabetes. So clearly really important problems. But the problem is that with incontinence, aside from the quality of life issue, there's also major impact on longevity as well. So first-line therapy is behavior modification. Second-line therapy is treatment with medication, in addition to the behavioral piece. And then third-line therapy tends to be more intensive and more invasive, so typically some type of surgical or invasive procedure. Let's look very briefly at treatment rates, however. So what we found in the Medicare population
was that only about 21% of the patients who have overactive bladder are actually being treated for it. We see that men are actually treated less frequently or at a lower rate than women, pretty significantly. We also see that there is a race disparity in treatment as well. And interestingly, what we found is that Hispanics were more likely to be treated for their OAB. However, that does have some negative consequences that you'll see in just a minute. So why do we care? Well, there's actually a pretty important unexpected burden of incontinence and overactive bladder in older patients. So first of all, one of the things that's really important is that people, whether they're male or female who have incontinence or overactive bladder, frequently suffer from depression. And even though incontinence is something that nobody wants to talk about, for folks who have this, it actually significantly impairs their quality of life. Many people map restrooms, so every time that they go out of the door, they have to plan where the restrooms are, and they have to time how much time they have in between going to the restroom so that they don't have an accident. There are many folks who have worsening symptoms of overactive bladder who actually never leave the house. And this really becomes a major problem over time, especially in the older population. One of the other things that's really important about this is that people who have urinary incontinence are much more likely to be put into a nursing home because of that. So for example, in one study in Northern California, a woman, if she's got urinary incontinence, is twice as likely to be put in a nursing home as a result of that, and a man 3 times more likely. And then there are other studies that corroborate that as well. And that's really absolutely a shame, especially when this is a condition that can be treated. The last thing, and probably one of the single most important emerging issues in medicine today, is around potentially inappropriate prescribing of medications in the elderly population. This is also known as PIMS. And what this is based on is really the fact that many medications that we have available today work on the same neurotransmission system within the body. And as a result, you can have drug-drug interactions, and you can have also drug-disease interactions. The American Geriatric Society has put together precautionary statements about this and specific things that physicians should be looking at, called the Beers criteria. And one of the things that we wanted to explore in the Medicare population was what was the rate of potentially inappropriate medication prescribing in patients who did have overactive bladder. One of the things that I'm going to show you, though, just quickly before we move to that data, is that in addition to the comorbidities associated with overactive bladder in terms of depression, we also see an increased risk of falls and fractures, and clearly that's a major problem. And we also see an increased risk of cognitive decline and of dementia. And unfortunately, in patients who have what's called a high anticholinergic burden, or a lot of medications that are working on the very same pathway in the body, they actually have an increased risk for dementia and for Alzheimer's disease. And unfortunately, this is not reversible upon discontinuation of the medication. So finally, I just want to show you what we saw in that Medicare data. What we found is that about 28% of folks who had overactive bladder and were actually treated with a potentially inappropriate medication. So that put them at pretty significant risk. We also found, if you remember, that in that Hispanic population where they had the highest rates of treatment, they also had the highest rates of being treated with potentially inappropriate medications. And then finally, 34% of those folks who are 74 years and older were actually treated with a potentially inappropriate medication. I've had this problem all day today. Thank you. So let's just go to, whoops, I went way too far, sorry. So in summary, there is a misperception, first of all, that incontinence and overactive bladder is a normal part of aging. So if there's anything that I could say, it is, first of all, let's have the conversations. If you're a practicing clinician in your practice, if you're not, within your family, with your mom, your sisters, your dad, or with yourself even. Secondly, that overactive bladder appears to be underdiagnosed in Medicare patients, and that it's also undertreated in Medicare patients. And this does create some problems down the road. Patients with overactive bladder have an increased risk of falls and fractures. The use of potentially inappropriate medications in Medicare patients with OAB was 28%. The use of potentially inappropriate medications is associated with an increased risk of cognitive impairment as well as falls and fractures. Hispanic women ages 75 and older with OAB were at the highest risk for exposure to potentially inappropriate medications. And these findings highlight the unexpected burden of OAB in the Medicare population and the association with cognitive impairment and falls and fractures. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to open the floor up for questions, but first I would like to take the liberty of tossing out the first question. I'm actually going to address it to you, Dr. O'Feely. You brought up the notion of promoting a culture of health. Mm-hmm. And I was hoping that you could speak to that, particularly given the audience and sort of the role of advocates. Mm-hmm. So the patient that was in your case study profile had the benefit of active parents that were able to get to you so that she had a team of advocates who were speaking on her behalf. The average person may not have that support system, so I was hoping that you could maybe provide some perspective on if you don't have that, how can we sort of bridge that divide, particularly for communities of color who are in the most need for that?
Yeah, so thank you very much. That's definitely a very good question. So from our experience, a lot of it really comes down to education and just taking the time to engage people, but also bringing in folks they trust. So, for example, our community advisory board, the members are from the community, and we go out and, you know, we talk to people, we do health screenings, but we really emphasize you gotta know what you're dealing with yourself, but also know what the options are. Obviously, nobody's gonna know that just because. So some of it too is helping them understand that their physician has a team of people around them, because everybody just always wants to talk to the doctor, and that you definitely need to get that bottom line information. But a lot of the times, especially with a condition like heart failure, you've got nurses around, you've got technicians, you've got people who can begin to even explain some things like, this woman she would never have known she had heart failure. And oh, by the way, one of the reasons the mom was so engaged in this space, she'd been working with the American Heart Association. So the American Heart Association, and obviously communities like the Multiple Sclerosis Society, right? Is that it? Multiple Sclerosis?
Similar, Accelerated Care Projects.
Yeah.
So we work together.
So these professional societies bring a lot to the table as well, just because of the army of people that, I mean, there's literally an army with the American Heart Association. So I think these all amount to, it is a lot, it is initially intimidating, but just step by step. And yes, and we do have the internet. Sometimes getting out there with your condition, there's a community that would come up, although I always warn people, you don't always want to really take everything you get on the internet. You've really got to sift through. So, but there's no shortcut. It's, at the end of the day, it's about just making patients understand they do have the power because this is their body. And so like this young woman, she's very shy, but she eventually said, you know, I'm going to go on TV with you because I want people to know about this, you know. Thank you for asking that.
No, absolutely. Holly, I wanted to say you are operating at the top of your license because the project and the solution that the project highlights, I think, is so impactful. So I was hoping that you might be able to speak to some potential policy solutions that you all may be looking at in the perspective of MS and how including that sort of into the research protocol can actually help to benefit communities of color and people from varying geographies who may not have had access to great CRNs and other research protocols.
Yeah. I'd say it's a little early yet because we are still trying to figure out, well, what are the specific barriers? You know, what was holding us back from having that full representation? I will say, I think one policy thing I would advocate for is when we went out and did our literature search, we found all kinds of studies about why aren't African Americans or why aren't Hispanics participating in research. And you find that in a lot of different health conditions, and you find it in different scientific topics like biorepositories. And sometimes you actually find out that there's not that big of a disparity, but sometimes you do. But when it came to looking for research on, you know, what role do scientists play in this, or what role do healthcare providers play in this, that's where the literature is a lot slimmer. And so I would love to, and I think I'll take this back to PCORI, and we'll do our bit in MS to the extent that we can, but I would like to take it back to PCORI or to the NIH or to other interested groups and say this is something that should probably be targeted. We'll be looking at some of those maybe infrastructure or transactional or institutional factors that might affect. I know that the NIH and other funders, when you apply for funding, you have to say, well, this is our target population. We expect to enroll so many people of, you know, men and women and different races and ethnicities. So they do want you to say, or they do want you to show what you're planning to do, but do they follow through on that? You know, if you say you're going to do this, are you actually going to do that? And if you don't, do they come to you and say, can we help you? You know, or what seems to be the holdup? I don't know that yet.
Okay.
So we're going to be looking into these things and disseminate what we find.
Perfect.
So there may be some policy ideas that come out of that.
Definitely, and I feel like today the conversation and the dialogue really sort of provided some pearls to what could happen down the line in terms of policy-based solutions. So Dr. Brand, you had mentioned the Medicare population being particularly vulnerable with regards to urinary incontinence and some of the drug-drug interactions and implications. So because of that vulnerability of that stakeholder group in Medicare, are there specific initiatives that you all are working on to address that particular population? You gave us a range from 40s to 70s. So definitely, if you're looking squarely at that Medicare demographic, are there specific solutions that you're targeting for that patient population?
Well, I think you know, there are a lot of educational materials that are distributed throughout various offices, but probably the most important thing is just to start the conversation. So again, if you're a healthcare provider, ask specifically about urinary incontinence and about the impact of it. And if not, really just start to have the conversation, especially if you're caring for a parent or a grandparent, because this is still quite taboo to talk about. And it has implications for cognitive impairment. It has implications for falls and fractures. So you've got somebody who's surviving their heart disease and surviving, perhaps even a cancer survivor, is managing their diabetes, and then they fall because of urinary incontinence. And what a shame that is. So just have the conversations.
This is for the audience. Do you feel that your providers are really operating at the top of their license? Do you feel that you have access to the clinical research community? I see people shaking their heads. So there's clearly a gap here, right? I mean, there's a divide that has been identified. So suffice to say that, so this panel has brought to light an important area. If we have a question, did you have a question for the panel? Fantastic.
Actually, I was just going to make a comment. So my brother and I share a genetic disease, and we need more health care than most people do. And he's a very sweet but incredibly intelligent person, and he cannot advocate for himself in that arena. And so we have to have this whole system where whenever he has an appointment, I block it off. And if I tell him, what's probably going to happen and what to say and what questions to ask. And then if it doesn't go the way I say it probably should, then he says, well, that's great. My sister is a pushy physician. Can you get her off my back? And then he hands the phone over to the physician. So, I mean, that's a level that we have to go through. And what if you don't have a sister who can push for you? Right. I think it's really, I get a little bit upset because, what are we doing in the medical education and the residency training that we get to the point where otherwise, I remember starting med school and being with a bunch of caring people who get beaten down by the system. What are we doing that we can't have more caring physicians who will listen to patients and really clue into what's going on?
That's perfect, because that was going to be sort of my segue into the last question, which was just quickly down the row, what do you feel could be the role of advocacy in your respective projects? What's really the role of advocacy? Because that's exactly what the individual who just came up, that's what really she was highlighting. What's the role of advocacy? Dr.
Well,
Brandt.
I think that there are so many opportunities for advocacy. I completely agree with you that I often wonder the same thing. First of all, in any particular disease area, if you can arm the folks that you're supporting with the right questions and even the right information. We were just having a conversation earlier that so much of the information that's in the medical literature that gets discussed at medical conferences never makes it to the lay press, or at least doesn't get translated in the right way. And so just making sure that people have the right information and feel encouraged to have the discussions would be super important. I guess perhaps even from a political perspective, one option would be to be advocates for more time with patients and physicians or their caregivers, whether that's advocating directly to policymakers or to payers in healthcare. There's not enough time to address the problems that need to be addressed in doctor visits.
Thank you.
And I think both those things.
Perfect.
I think there's actually a lot of power in advocacy that when you get a group of people who are pulling in one direction, there's obviously a lot of energy there, lots get learned, and people actually begin to recognize strengths they didn't know they had. So I think I do agree it's important that we not give up and look what happened with breast cancer.
Right.
So a lot of diseases that we see we have cures for now, it really took a lot of advocacy. I also want to say, in terms of just the whole information process, because at the end of the day, to be a good advocate, you have to have good knowledge. And the NIH actually has a lot of information. And all of the NIH institutes and centers have all disease categories on there, and then they have the lay equivalent of the data. So it is worthwhile. I know sometimes when you go on that website, it's really hard to know how to navigate, but just don't give up. And I think just go ahead and keep looking at those reliable sources, as I call them.
Perfect. Do you want to do a quick pearl, then we can take
Sure.
these 2 questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd say that in MS, we're really lucky to have a lot of strong advocacy organizations, and we're even luckier that we all work together pretty well,
Yep.
which is not always the case in different diseases.
That's
so.
right.
So that's one good thing. I think one good thing that we could come out of this project doing is to advocate to the pharma and biotech companies about being more inclusive in their clinical trials. You know, put enough pressure on them so that they give those incentives to the CROs to look further afield. And that way we can do a better job than 86 out of 2,400.
That's great. Yeah. Can take this question?
Hi, yeah, again, I work in this arena from the perspective of the pipeline, it's particularly underrepresented minorities, and I'm just wondering about your thoughts in terms of when students or people are preparing themselves for these different kind of careers that involve the work that you're talking about, what might be needed to make sure they come out of the pipeline already with this knowledge base, with this understanding and this perspective of how to care for this.
Dr. O'Feely, can you take that question? Okay.
So the pipeline really issue is very, very important. With the Association of Black Cardiologists project, also you heard some of the speakers from ABC earlier, just the mentoring that's needed is built into a number of these programs. So for example, the cardiovascular study, we are seeking funding so we can get fellows. So that's a little bit higher up in the pipeline, but we're also looking at residents and high school students and college students. Once you get started, then you begin to sort of have that ramp where they could, because people really get involved when they know about the disease, is demystified, and so that's how the pipeline, I think, could be connected instead of them sort of learning about stuff in a vacuum. I agree with you.
Perfect. Marcia.
I'm Marcia Henderson. I direct the Women's Office at FDA, and I want to do a shameless plug for the information that we have in our office. We have a lot of information related to products that people use every day for self-care, from hypertension to HIV to diabetes. And in those publications, which we ship for free and that you can download in 18 languages, we also have listed questions that you can ask your provider when you are getting a prescription for something. It also allows you to just hand it to them. If you're not comfortable asking the question, you can simply say, you know, FDA thinks maybe this would be good to know, and hand it to them, because it often prompts providers to provide information that they might not fully express when they are in the office. But my question to you, Dr. O'Feely, is related to your network and the identification post-market of products that may have had a dearth of people of color in them. I would like to learn more about which products you've selected, and also how you have made the choice about which one. And last but not least, have the drug trial snapshots helped you in any way as you go through that process?
Yes. Hey, Marcia, good to see you. Thank you for those wonderful questions. So in terms of the network, how we came up with the network, some of it was a convenient sample. We have institutions that have a commitment to health disparities. So the research centers of minority institutions include HBCUs, Hispanic Serving, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander institutions, and then we have federally qualified centers that are part of a network of physicians that we work with, and of course the Association of Black Cardiologists, their membership. So that's how that came about. In terms of the post-marketing surveillance, so we went to Duke, and there's a CARA registry out of, run by Laura Schanberg. Really looks at, from a practical standpoint, getting data in conditions that maybe not have been studied, just like we're talking about for heart failure. So we picked heart failure, we picked atrial fibrillation, but we also picked sickle cell because we feel like either, number one, these are conditions that are getting new drugs approved. Yeah, drug snapshots, yes, I looked at that, and you'll see where, for example, I won't mention the names, but most recent heart failure drugs have hardly any African American patients, and yet the ads are on TV where people are being, the implication is that African American patients are on TV with a heart failure drug. So a little bit of that is false advertising, I think, but some of it too is about they don't have the data. So we did visit the FDA with Rob Califf and say, we want to get this designation once our study is up and going and patients are in it, and you guys make sure our methodology meets the rigorous benchmarks that the FDA has. So that way, a company really won't have any excuse. And yes, they need to do it at the front end, but I'm just pessimistic that they will. Because at the end of the day, it is about the funding, and they're going to go to Eastern Europe, and there are no African Americans in Eastern Europe. So then we will get the same thing over and over and over again. And so we want to be able to say, okay, you've gone and you've done that. Well, by the way, we have opportunity for you to, don't try to build your own registry because it doesn't have the same power as if it's usual care in the standard of where people are receiving care. And then the other thing that the database will do is stop calling it registry because, who uses registry? So we don't want people not to come into it. But we call it a study now, but they also will be able to now recruit more quickly into trials. So we're trying to sort of block all the reasons. I didn't want me to shut up.
No. I don't. I do, but I don't. They're having a reception. The AMA is having a reception. So before we adjourn, can you just join me in thanking this fantastic panel? The hardest panel to do at the end of the day before the reception, especially when it's such robust dialogue. So we appreciate it so much. They'll be available for continued questions immediately following. Thank you so much.